So, welcome back, place branding students. Today we have a really, really exciting and privileged guest lecturer who's come to speak to you today. Malcolm Allan is the president of Bloom Consulting, but he's much more than that. He has a very long and storied career working in all facets of place management, urban development, city planning, and he ran his own place branding consultancy for many, many years. Tons of international experience working for major clients such as Israel and Australia, and he's almost single-handedly responsible for something called the Wild Atlantic Way, which is an amazing experience down the coast of Ireland that he did a place brand strategy on years ago. I've had the privilege of working with Malcolm on a few different consulting projects. I've learned a lot from him, and he's a great mentor to me. And I'm really, really grateful that he has made the time to come speak to you guys today, because this is a real blessing for you to get access to someone who is so senior and so internationally regarded in this place branding field. And Malcolm is particularly interested in sharing with you the really cutting edge direction of where place branding is going. And he's really on the front lines of making this a major issue in place branding circles. And as he'll talk about, he's got a lot of experience working with very high level industry people who are making this, making the climate emergency a priority in place branding. And this is going to be of particular interest to you as young people, because this is the direction that this field has to go in, because this is the future that we are going to be embracing. And I think places and cities especially, and nations, are going to be at the forefront in terms of making this a priority and helping save the planet, essentially. So without further ado, after that introduction, I'm really, really honored and I'm really happy to introduce Malcolm, who can take it away.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm astonished about how much you remember about my bad behavior over the past 25 years. Anyway, thanks for coming along, guys. I know you have a choice in these things, and just a bit of an introduction for why I am passionately concerned about the extent and strength of the links between place branding and climate emergency. As Janina will probably recall, we were both at a City Nation Place conference in London, the global conference in November 1919. And there was a consultancy there presenting on how you value brands. And at that point in the day, I hadn't heard anyone talking about the impact on branding, promotion, and marketing of place of the climate emergency. Significantly in the news at the time was a whole series of reports about the bushfires happening simultaneously in Northern California, Queensland, and Victoria in Australia. And these people were presenting as though the world was not impacting, and they had not taken into account anything about the destructive effects on people, on business, community, on settlement, on landscape, on the flora and the fauna, the animals and the flowers of places that were being burnt to the ground in tens of thousands of square meters of land and space. And yet, at the same time, in California and in Australia, the tourism boards were still promoting those areas as though somehow at this point in time they were safe and the attractions were still there, and there were no barriers on entry and no barriers to get to the attractions. And on one of those days, just before the conference, I looked at a particular place, and at the time of the conference, it had burnt to the ground. And so it just struck me that nature in tooth and claw, affected by the rise in carbon in the atmosphere and many other factors, was actually beginning to have an effect on the truthfulness of the marketing of places, on the information that people would need if they were going to travel or go to work or move a business or invest in a place. This severely needed taking into account. And yet, at this particular conference, the firm that was talking about it was basically not taking this into account. I just felt that something had to be said about this. And so I've been researching it. I've been talking to people, clients that I work with, and most people I've been talking to in the industry are beginning to get it now. I mean, I sincerely hope that the things that people like David Attenborough is saying may not come to pass, but you are of a generation where unless we really, as a world, as a global entity of people, tackle this seriously, your quality of life, your quality of prospects of economy might be endangered. So we all need to actually take this seriously and do something about it. So why try and connect place branders to the climate emergency? A very simple reason. It is happening. We're living it. It's now. It's not something that's in the future, and it's gathering pace. The news is full of stories of places being flooded, of drought, of damage being caused. You just need to look at the kind of issues around about the preparedness for severity of weather changes in the state of Texas over the past 3 weeks. And there are a lot of issues about supply and politics in this, but a major American state has just been found significantly wanting in its ability to continue to supply power in extreme weather conditions. This is not a one-off. This is not something that may only happen once every 100 years. This is happening with increasing regularity. So we're living in this. Why should we be concerned? Because if we are charged with, I don't run a place branding agency for a government agency or a city. I run an advisory consultancy. My advice to them is you have to be honest about this. You can't hide this under the bush because the bush is probably going to get burnt. You can't shy away from it because this is really happening. And it's affecting many places around the world. It's affecting the perceptions that people have of place. So if you are in a place that is burning to the ground, you may rightly expect very few people to come and see it. But yet, tourist boards continue to promote places as though these things aren't happening. Therefore, when that disconnect is happening, it affects the reputation of a place. You want to be assured that they are mitigating its effects. Some of the best thinking in place branding at the moment is going on with what's called Build Back Better, Build Back Green as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and managing that, taking down the disease. What we have now is an opportunity. There are two major points of inflection in the world to try and influence how cities, nations, towns, states, developers brand and market their places. The first is COVID. Jury's out for me on just how soon we'll be clear of it. Personally, I think that it's taught us some lessons about the kind of places we build and the kind of offices we work in. And I think what we're going to see is an inflection point at which the whole design of cities, town centers, office buildings, factories is going to change to take account of this, but also taking account of the opportunity it gives us to build back better, build back green in terms of places that have sustainability, places that are taking the mitigation of the impacts of place branding seriously. So unless you are, in my view, taking this on board, it will negatively assess your perception of people's perceptions of your place. If they can read the news and see what's happening in a place, but you're not reflecting what you're doing to either minimize it, stop it, or plan for it to be dealt with in the future. If you're saying nothing about the impacts, then people can justifiably ask the question, why? Why are you not dealing with that? And that's why I think it affects place brands. And for those places that aren't dealing with that, I think it's going to damage their brands. It's going to damage their integrity, the integrity of the local authority or the prime minister or the mayor or the president. If they're just not dealing with it, the integrity of it pretending it's not there. You only have to look at the comparison between Trump and Biden in the United States to get a sense of that. We need to take it seriously. We need to be asking tough questions of the people around us who are working in place branding, either in the place branding team or in the local government or in the tourism department or the destination or the attraction, whatever it is. I think it behoves us to start asking, debating, and finding answers to these questions. Because if we don't, there will be major problems. And I can't put my hand on my heart and promote a brand that I think is willfully neglecting the potential impacts of the climate emergency. I wouldn't want to work for a place that operates like that. Luckily, in a sense, we're not alone. There are many tens of thousands, probably millions of people around the world who now take this seriously. There are many people demonstrating. There are many people voicing their fears about it. And what I see happening on the streets and in these demonstrations is a reflection in much of what they're saying, that their place is not taking it seriously, that their place is not governing to manage the mitigation and the impacts of this. So it's not just about the marketing and promotion, because you think about it, what we're marketing and promoting, if we are talking about mitigating effects, it is often not actually the responsibility of the place branding team. It's probably the responsibility of the cabinet office. It's the responsibility of the mayor or the president or the governor or whoever. It's responsibility of engineering departments, people in transportation systems, people who deal with flood warnings, etc., etc. If they are not yet dealing with that, I think it's incumbent upon place branders to have the courage and the conviction to begin to address these issues in the places that they work. And this slide just summarizes some of the many impacts that are already happening. This is not willful thinking or wishful thinking or imaginative thinking. These things are happening. Coastal areas are being washed away. You can look at the coastlines of Suffolk and Norfolk in this country and see houses collapsing into the sea. I saw an item this morning of a cemetery on the Italian coast that has collapsed into the sea as a result of storm damage, with the coffins floating about on the water. It's issues around about in very hot climates. Can we continue to live there? Can we continue to work there? Is it not just getting too hot to continue to conduct economic activity? This might seem far-fetched to you sitting, as you do, in the United Kingdom, where we don't have such extremes as they do in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. But we do have effects of it. You can look around and see the extent to which climate change and flooding has changed the urban landscape from around about November through to about March or April every year for the past 12 or 13 years. Pictures on TV of flooded country areas are now commonplace. So what is the Environment Agency doing to tackle that? It's not that it's not doing anything. What it's doing is probably lagging behind the impact and the effects of what's going on. What's interesting about the UK at the moment is that there is no national brand. We have 4 separate countries. Which country do you think is most advanced in terms of having a national brand? Scotland, England, Ireland, or Wales? I'm not sure what your view is, but for me, it's Scotland, not because I just come from there. You may find traces of it in my accent, but because they're actually taking these issues seriously and saying, in coming to Scotland, we want you to know this is what we're doing about mitigation of COVID, and this is what we're doing about mitigation of the climate emergency, because these are things that investors and people looking for jobs should be able to get answers to, should want the place they're thinking of moving to be seriously taking into account. So in summary, this affects nature. It affects the landscapes which have been burnt to the ground. It affects the many millions of creatures which have been killed in the last 3 summers of Australian bushfires. It affects settlements. Whole townships have been burnt to the ground. And it affects investment in the area, and it affects tourism. These things are all now being impacted. It's not a threat of them being impacted in the future. They're being impacted now. And one of the most major contributory factors, if not drivers of this, is the rise in carbon emissions in the atmosphere. From pollution, from coal burning, fossil fuel burning power stations, reducing the air quality, making places very unattractive to go to. I was in China a couple of years ago, and it was a real concern to me that just as I was finally going to the airport, I was reading on the internet that the air quality in Shanghai, where I was flying to, was in fact at a danger level to affect my health, and was actually affecting the health of the people who were there. And it just was not being sufficiently tackled. So in branding terms, that affects your reputation as a place, your reputation for being a safe place, a cognizant place, a place that takes action. And for me, I'll come back to this several times in the course of these remarks, being able to say you're taking action is a good story. It is a positive thing. When I started to talk about this to press branders around the world, some mayors and some city councillors would say, we don't want to tell people bad news stories. We don't want to tell them how polluted we are. We want them to come here and enjoy themselves. My point is that, yes, if you want to shy away from it, people will find you out. So far better to get on the front foot and say, yeah, it is a big problem. It's a big problem to deal with. We'll have to deal with it over time, but now we're just starting out. This is something we want to tell you that we are taking seriously. So if you think about the myriad ways in which you're wandering around the city, you are being polluted as you walk down a street. The pollution from vehicle emissions is high. There are parts of London where the emissions emergency rules were triggered last year because the pollution levels had reached levels at which it was damaging for health. If you're just walking past it on your way to work and you don't live in the area, it's much less of a problem. But imagine if you're living there permanently and you've got the problem of this high level of vehicle fume emission 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, every year that you live in the place. And it has effects on people's capacity to breathe. It contributes to respiratory diseases. It contributes to brain damage in young children. It needs to be dealt with. Increasingly, we're seeing places being flooded, both through storms, like Hurricane Sandy. You only have to look at the extent to which from North Carolina down the Atlantic coast into the Gulf of Mexico and round through Texas, down into Salvador and Costa Rica, to see all the areas where flood damage caused by a rise in seawater levels, by storms and typhoons is wreaking havoc. It's happening. So this damages the quality of life. And it's a whole series of bad news stories. People's health has been damaged by the poor air quality from the rise of CO2. It's setting areas on fire. The fires are destroying business. Flooding is causing major problems. You hear those stories on the news of people who live in the Yorkshire Dales and Calderdale, where they've had floodwaters 3 years in a row. They cannot get insurance on their houses now. It takes more than a year for them to dry out. They're uninhabitable. Do they get rent grants to go and live in places? Not anymore, because once you're in a floodplain or a flood course, you can't get insurance on your house. That means you can't sell your house. And we've got a whole system of building in floodplains because of the shortage of housing. There surely has to be a better solution to this than building for the inevitability of a flood that means the place cannot be sold again, and therefore you've made the wrong investment decision. So mitigation is, for me, a good news story. Protecting wildlife, helping towns to build fire breaks, reducing respiratory illnesses, improving the air quality, taking many efforts to reduce CO2, protecting the coasts, helping tourism restart again. These are all good things you can say about your area if that's what you're going to do. And there's quite a lot of research that now shows that the mitigation of the impacts of climate change for the longer term is significantly lower than ignoring it and paying the price of the damage it will cause. Quite a few studies have been published in the last couple of years that show that to be the case. What's not yet happening is that governments are actually setting aside and creating budgets for annual mitigation cost alleviation. In the same way they have budgets to build more roads, to build more housing for public health and hospitals. I think this is something that's not going to go away, and therefore there should be an annual cycle of potential investment to mitigate the potential costs of this happening. So in this country, just a few examples. Leeds City Council has declared a climate emergency and established a commission. And I'm going to take you through a case study of what this actually means in practical terms, because quite a few places have declared climate emergencies and then said, this is complicated. We'll have to think about what to do. So it's a bit like our government declaring Article 50 in the Brexit negotiations without having really thought through what were the implications of planning for that. So the point is, if you're going to declare a climate emergency as a place, you really have to have a plan of action to deal with it. Other than that, it just becomes a policy decision written on paper with not a lot happening. Manchester has done the same. Aberdeen has done the same. What's interesting at some of the London boroughs, Islington is just one of about 10 or 12 examples, that they have net zero carbon by 2030 targets and an action plan to actually bring that down and deal with it. So I think it's time for place branders to face up and take this seriously. Inaction by us and the people we work for will only damage brand reputation. It will limit investment. It will limit the attraction of talented people. If you, as students, have a choice upon leaving university of jobs in certain places, in my view, you should be looking at what is that place or that authority or that agency or that location doing about not just COVID, but about place protection in the face of the climate emergency. There is scope for mitigation. Here are some examples that different places are dealing with. The first is investing in electric vehicle charging points. In the small town that I live in down in West Sussex, we have a municipal car park at the top of the town that now has 2 of these charging points. And we're surrounded by, I think it's 7 to 10 fossil fuel petrol stations. So you begin to see, it clicks in my mind, okay, are we really taking this as seriously as we should be? Beginning to invest in battery-driven, electric-powered public transport. A very good example of that is Coventry District Council in the West Midlands, worth looking at as an example. But you can still see very large numbers of public transport vehicles burning fossil fuel. So we're at the beginning of this process. One of the examples I'm going to show you, Southampton, aims to have more than half of its fleet electric powered by 2025, 4 years' time. And aims to try and have the majority of all public transport in the city electrified by 2030, in 9 years' time. We can invest in zero carbon housing. What does that actually mean? What it means is that it will be the houses will be powered by solar or other forms of non-pollutant energy generated, housing that is significantly insulated, housing that has minimum energy waste, housing that whose waste is managed and recycled. All of these things can and are beginning to be done. Green buildings. Green buildings are buildings that minimize the use of fossil fuel, that maximize the use of recyclable fuel, and that minimize the impact on the environment from the emissions and maximize the reduction in costs of living in the place through building technologies. One big issue is that this obviously adds more cost to the cost of a new dwelling or retrofitting an existing building. The biggest challenge in Greater London in terms of CO2 emissions and being green is not the challenge of getting new developers to build new buildings that are sustainable. That's beginning to happen. It's the huge charge of hundreds of thousands of Edwardian, Victorian, even Georgian buildings from the 18th century till now, having to be retrofitted by owners who either don't understand how to do it, don't want to do it, cannot afford to do it, who won't get grants to do it. You may have read in the news that the government has had a green rebuilding scheme now for about 2 years, but only about, I think it's 5% of the grants have been taken up. And a very large number of people applying for the grants have had their applications turned down. So you're seeing policies not actually being enacted or carried through because it's not yet reached a point of inflection where people are saying, well, why aren't you doing this? This is simply, it's tokenism. You really should be following through on those actions. And it's just not just about residential buildings, it's also about retrofitting the many factories we've got that continue to pump out emissions and use fossil fuel systems. Green cities, the research is showing, are much more sustainable, not just building a new city, but putting green into a city. Cities can make small-scale incremental improvements. This is an example of a green scheme on a vacant bit of land at the edge of Edgware Road Tube Station. Some of you may know it. But lots of these schemes they're not just greening the particular area. They're actually action by London Transport and the borough councils to say, we are trying to be more green. We want to be more green. They are demonstration projects. They are signaling to people that green can be achieved. This is an example from a project in Singapore called Gardens by the Bay. These are in fact metal structures with viewing points. Some of you may have been there. It's an amazing place, but it's capturing energy from the sun and recycling it, and the energy is feeding the greenery that is growing up it. So it's very much, in fact, an integrated green installation. The city in Europe, and for me, the city in the world that is taking this most seriously is Copenhagen, with green energy production and green buildings and recycling. And they have declared the first district, kind of like a London borough, Osterbrock, as the city's first sustainable green district. It's a really good example of what can be done. And they are beginning to use this as an example in their place branding, as a way to keep the population, as a way to retain people, a way to retain students and investment, as well as promoting it as the way that districts should actually be built and managed in the future. So cities have considerable scope, in my view, to mitigate the impacts of climate change. They have power, they have budgets, but do they have the will to do it? That is often what's lacking. And being willing to accept the challenge, means in effect that it's an ongoing budgetary consideration. This is not something with a half life and a quarter life. It'll be done in 5 years' time. This is something that now, in my view, has to become the norm, that there is a climate change mitigation action plan and budget that gets added to year by year. And I think there are positive stories that we can therefore tell residents, businesses, investors, and visitors. And the telling of that story will enhance the city brand. So why wouldn't you want to tell it? Here's a good example. Reclaimed urban wetlands in East London as part of the Thames Gateway. It's defined as a green and blue neighborhood, access to the water, a lot of greenery. And what research has shown is that people are on average more healthy in such areas, and children play outside more often because the parents trust that the air is of sufficient quality and that the greenery is of benefit to them. So it comes down to things like that, your trust in the environment, your trust that where you live isn't going to damage the health of your children. Here's a case study example. Southampton had its first place brand strategy back in 2004. I was then working for a firm called Place Brands, that I think was one of the very first place branding agencies set up in the country. And part of that work involved Southampton, which was an ocean city. And it was very much about reconnecting the city with its waterfront and the area around the Solent. Nearly 15 years later, that brand has been revived by something known as the Green City Charter. They recognized that they had to take the climate emergency seriously. They did declare in 2019 a climate emergency as part of a charter that would take them through an action plan of 11 years up to 2030, when they would hope that the city as a whole, not just the city council, but the entire city would be measured as free from carbon emissions by that point in time. It's a very good case study example of a local authority that has taken it absolutely seriously and is now telling the story to enhance its attractiveness, to retain its population, retain its businesses, attract new talent, very actively working with its 3 universities and its FE colleges in that respect. And it's no accident that the Southampton area is, with the leadership of the City Council, has one of the most active COVID-19 mitigation plans and a very active Build Back Better, Build Back Green, which is now being integrated with the climate emergency plan. So the key objectives are to get to that neutrality position by 2030. A major part of it is going to be about reducing energy use through sustainable buildings, through buildings that don't use fossil fuel, that use cheaper electricity. And the city is now part of a network of local government that has actually got together. I think it's about 110, 120 local authorities that are now clubbing together to buy green energy at cheaper rates because they're mass purchasing it. They're also looking into renewable energy generation, buildings that have renewable energy systems within it that can sell their extra energy back into the national grid. In a very small way, I contribute to that. I've got 16 solar panels on my roof. I got a government grant about 9 years ago of about £8,000 or £9,000, and I feed electricity into the national grid. I now pay, after 11 years, about 25% of the price for my electrical needs as I did 11 years ago. And if that isn't an argument for doing it, I don't know what is. The electrical vehicle networks, which I talked about earlier, clean air compliance, actually getting people to recognize that the way they burn rubbish, the way they use fuel can have an impact on them, their family, their neighbors, etc. And one of the benefits is to actually increase life expectancy, because respiratory diseases have been rising in the United Kingdom for a very long time now. And they need to be tackled. They have an effect. They limit the quality of people's lives. Therefore, Southampton has taken what I would call an expansive approach to this. It's a very good example of people who take it seriously, don't just say, yeah, we're going to deal with it, but say, right, before we make the announcement, let us figure out how we're going to deal with it. And from a place branding point of view, as they take action, as it begins to implement, you can then begin to feed those stories into the media. You can tell good stories about what you're doing. People that can themselves come forward and say, I used to be ill, I'm no longer ill. I really like this place. It is much greener. I think it's much healthier for my children and my safety, etc. And so it can and has a major feed in to the stories you tell about the place and why it's a good place to live and work or visit or come as a tourist or go to and study. And I think all of that cumulatively over time will have an impact. So in addition to that, what Southampton has also been doing is integrating into it what they call citizen energy investment, which is getting people to club together in neighborhoods to buy electricity, not just individually, but collectively, and to buy them from low emission or no emission suppliers. It's a waterfront area, and in organizing Green and Build Back Better for COVID, they've recognized that they now have a real opportunity to actually alleviate flooding, and they're beginning to look at flood defense systems that are also sustainable, and they're green, and they can actually be accessed by the public, a bit like when you can go and see the London Thames barrier, which has actually now been turned into a green and sustainable attraction area. And they've introduced a biodiversity action plan. Biodiversity is about flora and fauna, about greening areas again, about encouraging wildlife and recognizing that the air emissions are going down. Therefore, it means that the flora and fauna have more chance of living and breathing, being sustained, having a life, regenerating every year. And all of that can then have an impact on health and well-being and how people see the city and give them a sense of well-being. So this can be a very integrated approach. And that's a key thing to take away, is that this is not just an optional added extra. This, I think, has to go center stage of how cities actually manage and develop their offers, how they manage the city, how they invest in the city. This impacts on all sorts of other plans, and all sorts of other plans can feed into it and contribute to it. So in summary, I think there's a very positive story to tell if you take it seriously and are serious about it. Again, it's a set of good news stories. It's all the things that you're doing, that you've protected, that you've reduced, where you've increased the quality, that you're managing it, and that you've got methods in place that actually are accepted by all the stakeholders of the place, because this will never happen to the extent that it needs to if it's just left to the local authority. A very good example I read about earlier this week was that Oxford City Council last week held the first citywide climate change emergency planning meeting with, I think it's about 135 or 40 of the major stakeholders. So the health services, the transport services, the universities, the museums, all medium and big sized service providers in the city. And they've actually now started the process of reporting to each other on their action plans, starting to have an integrated set of actions, not just separate actions, recognizing that they can, and I use the derogatory term, feed off each other, but in a very positive way. So coming to kind of sum it up as to some things that you might like to think about. How might you, as you go into marketing or branding, play a role here? So the key thing to keep in mind is communicating the action to mitigate climate change impacts is important. And it is as important as promoting the current offer or the current product. Why is that? Because if we don't take that action, it can damage the current offer and can damage the current product. And therefore, alongside what you're saying about the place, why you should visit it, why you should invest there, should be those stories that are true and honest about what the place is doing, what the businesses are doing to actually tackle this set of issues. So what research has actually shown is that all over the world, people are waking up to the climate emergency, helped in many respects by those wonderful films that David Attenborough has made by the BBC, highlighting the impact on sea life of plastic being ingested as they swim through it, highlighting the blue planet, highlighting most recently the impacts of all the fires and the flooding and the heat and the cold. There's no climatic condition that is not free from this or doesn't conspire to do it. So one of the key challenges is to get to know the climate emergency. There are plenty of good sources, introductory sources, plenty of books, reports published, but most certainly the place to look at is the website that is for COP26, the next climate change conference in Glasgow in November. And as an aside, I'm hoping with the Urban Land Institute to have a spot on what we would call the fringe to the conference to talk about this set of issues I'm sharing with you today. So it's important you get to know about it, because if you are persuaded that, yes, there is a role for place branding, product branding and marketing, tourism communication, whatever it is, to play here, then you want to be able to understand how it impacts on the service or the initiative that it's your responsibility to brand and promote. It's then worth sharing that with colleagues. What I'm finding is that, yes, we have a direct relationship often with the president of a country or the mayor of a city and the cabinet office, and usually with the board of the chief officers. We're often called in before there's a branding team, but quite often there is a branding team and it's quite small. They themselves need to establish what their colleagues in the other departments are thinking about, the extent to which they understand what's going on. They might well get surprised. The engineers in an environment department may already be taking quite a lot of the action. We find this a lot, but what we find is that no one has thought to kind of bring it all together into a single story that they communicate. So it's quite important to actually understand what one's colleagues are doing in the other departments or the other stakeholders of the place are doing. Then identify your audience. Now, at one level, it should be the entire audience of the people who live, work, visit your place. But for many places, there are priorities. For many places, it is people who live in the areas of highest pollution that are the priority. And therefore, they are more at risk from the respiratory diseases. Therefore, it's just an example. It may not just be everyone at the same time. It may be some groups ahead of others. Lights, camera, action. That's basically saying, when you're ready, light it up, take action, record what you're doing and promote it. Lights, camera, action's basically about getting on with it. And you have to create, you have to be part of and help create what I call a lasting community of serious intent. Again, this is not just like a commission working for 5 years. This is recognizing that this is something we all have a role to play in, and that agencies and government departments should be taking this on board as something that is now for a long time. And it may be forever. I don't know. There's no way I can guess on that. But this is certainly not a set of short-term quick fix solutions. This is actually about taking it seriously and knowing that it will take a long time to deal with it. So to do that, and this is teaching grandmothers to suck eggs, forgive me, but you need to employ clear reasoning. There's an entire industry now that is of people writing books about the destructive communication, lies, and distortions of communication by the fossil fuel industry around the world. You need to understand that there will be out there people who are vehement climate deniers and will attack what you're doing. Not you personally, individually. I've been very lucky in that respect. I've had people shout at me, but I'm quite used to that, so that doesn't bother me. But there will be people who will challenge you. So therefore, having clear reasoning, having the evidence to hand, make this a data-driven initiative. Data-driven in the sense of the issues and the problems, data-driven in the sense of how you impact it on through your actions and how the investment's paying off. You need to be very clear about what your offer that's being protected is and the offer that's being developed, which is in line with green, build back better sustainability. And you need to be very precise about the scale and nature and location of the action. It's not just saying, oh, we're starting a housing renewal program that will result in 2,000 houses being more energy efficient. You want to be able to say to people, it's in this neighborhood, you can go and see it. The housing industry uses what's called show houses, often or not, when they're building estates. So imagine a show house that actually demonstrates to people all the things that can be done and they can be helped with to actually make it a more energy efficient, safer, warmer, less polluting dwelling to live in. Which are some of the benefits. You really have to adopt what I would call a what's in it for me state of mind. What's in it for me really is about saying, well, for that particular group, what are the benefits they're going to get from this? Why should we encourage them to do it? It's about recognizing there's no one set of messages that applies to absolutely everyone. It's an age-old marketing dictum. With the power of the internet and the communications that we can run with it, we can target and focus our messages very much more precisely than ever before and understand the channels to your market. Where are they going to go to get messages like this? And I'll give you one very simple example. I'm seeing in places like Wicks, the builders, the big wholesale builders, depots, messages about the value, the energy saving value of different products, the sustainability values of heat retention of different products. This is beginning to come alive to people working in that kind of industry. They're beginning to really understand that whilst, yes, you can say to people, oh, you should be rehabilitating your housing, you have to get down to saying, and here are the particular tools and products and systems you can actually use to do that. So what's the story? Is it as the song says, morning glory? I hope so. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Malcolm. Wow, so much to think about there, and so many big issues to consider. I want to open it up to you guys now. This is your opportunity to ask Malcolm questions. And hopefully you've got some good ones. These, and keeping in mind, he has a long history working in place branding. So if you've got practical questions that might relate to your own place brand strategy, I'm sure he'd be willing to answer them. Or, more specifically, if you've got questions about how places can help with this mitigation strategy and telling a good news story, how do you convert these changes into a good news story, and how do you help promote that? I think, I'll kick off while you guys think about them. Simona from Lithuania is saying, thank you for your presentation. You helped me a lot and gave me new ideas on how I can improve my place branding strategy. So that's great. That's exactly what I was hoping. And I would definitely, if you guys have any questions about how you can integrate green thinking into your own place brand strategies, I think these would be very effective conversations and questions to ask Malcolm. I was taken by this last example around Wix and how, because that to me introduced a new channel that, as you were saying, understand the channels and know where you can reach people. Working with the retail sector is an opportunity that I hadn't really considered before in terms of, the home building sector, the gardening sector, anywhere that sort of relates to people's homes and where they are. That's a really interesting perspective, and it expands the stakeholder environment that we're working with. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that I think you have to come at this slightly laterally, by which I mean be imaginative, think outside the box. Where are the places that are selling products and services that can impact on this and can help an individual or a family in their own way make a contribution? I've, for example, completely double glazed my house. I've lined it with heat retention material. I put 16 solar panels on the roof. I buy my electricity from a low emission supplier, and so on. Now, not everyone is able to do that, but if I go down, as I now do, to the local Wix and building centre, and I'm struck by seeing that the messaging on the products is not yet about buy this because it will help you contribute towards minimizing or mitigating the effects of climate change. But it's more to say, buy this product and your heating costs will fall. Buy this product and you can insulate more, or whatever it is. So when you're looking at the retail industry, whose job it is to sell products, what are the range of products that can assist in this process? And an obvious one now is the very large number of car makers who are saying that after 2030, there will be no diesel powered cars on the road from that company. And my point in the lecture there about having 2 charging points in East Grinstead, as opposed to, say, I have 8 pumps per petrol station and 6 of them around East Grinstead, 48 places that I can buy diesel or petrol, unleaded, of course. The issue is around about where do we get access to the tools and services where we spend our money on things in our lives that can actually begin to contribute towards this. And we can know that in buying in that way, we're beginning to make a contribution. Research has actually shown, attitudinal research has shown that whilst more people know about climate change now and are concerned about it, a similar proportion of people are kind of going, well, how the hell do I play a part in this? This is just, it's too big. It's them over there. It's people up there. It's governments. And in fact, initiatives like communities getting together to buy things from suppliers that don't use fossil fuel, that reduce the costs of buying that fuel, etc., are ways to think around about it, which is why I think helping communities organize to look at the options they have for their particular area, the type of climate they're in, how can they together take action on doing this? So take it out of the individual house and let people work with each other and encourage that to happen.
Yeah, great.
And I think that in terms of the media, and I've had nearly 40 years of dealing with the media about the initiatives I worked on, one thing consistently has held true for that period of time. Bad news is usually one of 2 kinds. It's, well, 3. Crime, corruption, and individuals doing bad things to each other, like maiming them, killing each other. Good news is, again, more interestingly, concentrated on people, good news stories about people doing good. So the media will take an official pronouncement, a communique, an announcement from the local government, the agency or whatever seriously, but with a certain amount of questioning about it. It's not something that they'll run with particularly, but a good news story of a community or an individual, people doing their part, companies playing their part, companies changing their energy sources, interviews with the people running the company, interviews with workers there about their part in it. What I'm really saying is tell your news about these kind of initiatives at a level to people about people like them. Not, oh, yeah, I would love to have the power and the resources of the Mayor of London to do all sorts of things. And true, I would like to have that power and resource, but I'm never going to get it. But if I can read a story about how someone has taken an initiative at the level of their community, which has had community benefits wider than the individual, then that's something I could think about emulating and replicating. It's human nature.
So arm your communities, arm your local communities with initiatives that are achievable and accessible to them, and then tell those stories back to the community as a way to elevate your place brand strategy. And that impacts the residents as well as the tourists and the investors who might be outside looking in.
Yeah, I mean, the parallel in the sense of, you mentioned the Wild Atlantic Way, which is a 3,500 kilometer tourism driving route on the west coast of Ireland on the Atlantic coast. And it's called wild because for most of the year it is very wild in environmental and energy from the waves terms. The thing we learned when we were doing the branding of that was to tell stories. It's a tourism project, to tell stories about the people who were providing the way, and also to allow people and give an opportunity of people who were visiting it to tell their stories about their experience on the way. So the parallel for an initiative like this with climate change is to provide outlets, to give the people who are taking it seriously a voice, to enable school kids who are doing not just a learning project in a secondary, but actually something where they're working with the janitorial staff and the maintenance staff to actually make the school classrooms more energy efficient physically around about them. Those are the kind of stories that really have an impact. And my hope is that with sufficient people recognizing they can do something about it, in coming together as a community, they can then raise the ante and the volume and their demands for things they don't have budgetary control over, but they do elect the officials who have that budgetary control. And that's a really key point, being able to give the community influencing strategies. It can be a bit tortuous at times, being a place brander, being asked to promote a particular council policy in the traditional kind of like, we met last night as full council and here's the communique about it. That's, that isn't going to wake me up in the morning. That's not going to give me interest to go, oh, I could do that. So it's those I could do that stories that are much more powerful, and it's harnessing that.
Does anyone else have any questions for Malcolm? This is your chance. You could tell him about what place brand strategy you're working on and see if he knows anything about the climate situation there and how you might integrate it into your own strategy. Or if you've got any bigger questions about place branding. Sasha.
Hi, yeah, I have, so it's not based on the assignment, but I wanted to ask whether this idea of greenwashing, whether it exists with place branding as well, and if it does, how we might try to avoid greenwashing in our strategies.
I think to a degree, I can see greenwashing in tourism branding and marketing. Where some of the initiatives I think are almost tokenist. They're kind of well, here's what we're going to do, and we may as well paint it a bit green while we're doing it. That's a very easy cop-out. I think at the moment, there's not much evidence of places greenwashing climate emergency mitigation plans. If you think about it, I mean, if they've decided to have a plan and they're implementing it, the likelihood is that they don't need greenwashing, and it's more likely that it is going to contribute to, I don't know what the obverse of greenwash is, because greenwash is a negative comment, but they're contributing towards people understanding that green is positive and powerful and beneficial, and it's for permanency. Because although I've been, to quote the English expression, batting on about this for about 2 years now, we're only now beginning to see examples of that. A very good example, however, at a national level is the work that Costa Rica is doing on their nation brand strategy. And I need to be honest and say I have familiarity with it, because with another colleague, we've been advising the Costa Rican government on their green sustainability strategy since 5 years ago. And I take no credit for it. It's what they've done themselves. But it's a very good example of how they're using investments in green technology, green care, sustainability issues to actually create what is now a global perception that they are a global leader in harnessing natural hydro, wave power, wind power to reduce emissions, but at the same time investing in green jobs, green recycling companies, green plant growth, green protection for animal species, flora and fauna. A very comprehensive, all-enveloping strategy that has got the entire population, a significant percentage of the population involved through education programs, further education, universities. It's permeated the psychology, the psychosis, the perceptions of the people in the country. It's really worth looking at, and that's where, in effect, they've been seen as one of the most green countries in the world, but it's not a washing effect. It's like they've been dyed green right to the heart and soul. Have I answered your question?
Yes, thank you.
Shash is calling in from Malaysia, so we've got a truly international audience here for you today, Malcolm. Yeah, that's a really interesting, fascinating idea to think that, you know, because we've talked in other modules about product brands who greenwash and say, oh, look how environmentally eco we are, and there's no real rules and regulations. But I think in a place branding context, you can't get away with it as easily, because you've really got to prove that the initiatives are happening for you to be able to promote them. And it's not as simple as just to sort of slap a, you know, 100% natural logo on a city because we'll call you out. I mean,
there are some countries where there are greening initiatives taking place in particular states and territories, in particular towns and cities, yet where the national government is still investing in fossil fueled, coal-fired power stations. And that's one of the issues that I think Costa Rica managed to overcome, because they realized that if they had a bit of very on-brand green over here, but at the same time they had fossil fuel extraction and CO2 emissions rising over there, they would affect each other. They would affect reputation. I mean, it's like Britain is hosting COP26, and Boris Johnson's government have recently given permission in Cumbria for a brand new coal mine. And they've said it's because it will create 400 jobs. It's a coal mine. So the coal that's taken out of that ground will not be burnt in Cumbria, but it will be because they don't have power stations in that coal-fired power stations there. It'll go to other parts of the country and other parts of the world with coal-fired power stations. So one of the things about looking at the concept of green is, what are the paradoxes at work in the place? Which is why Southampton, I think, I return to it again, and there's another very good example you could look at, which is Bristol, and you should look at Exeter. Now, there's one significant, interesting thing about all those three cities. None of them are former major drivers of the Industrial Revolution. They're places that have a more positive relationship with their surroundings. And therefore, if you like, they've not had the infrastructure of the old systems of energy generation to deal with. We do have interesting things happening in Manchester and Birmingham, where the local authorities are beginning to take this very seriously. The city of Coventry, I mentioned earlier on. So one of the issues is the paradox of, well, how do we get out of coal-fired energy generation whilst we're doing all these other green initiatives? And the straight answer to that is you have to have a plan for doing so. You have to actually bite the bullet of planning the replacement sources. This is not easy for places to do, which I guess is why it's taking so long to get people serious about it. And I think it's one of the reasons why there are not more places actively plowing ahead with it, because they realize that any such declaration is going to cost them a great deal of money. But we do have the planet to think about, is my view on that. And if everyone just hesitates and says, no, we can't afford to do it, then we're buying the costs of increased mitigation. We're not buying the mitigation, we're buying the damage of the permanence of that CO2 emission on the planet.
Who else has a question?
I'd just like to, I can't see everyone, I'd just like to get a sense of, do you think this is a serious initiative that you should get involved with? Hands up.
I was saying that I was reading the WWF World Wildlife Organization report, and their 2020 agenda is like reducing carbon emission in the UK and boosting greens and like reducing paper, cutting down plastic. Do you see that place branding agencies or government agencies should tie up with organizations like WWF, PETA, WHO, and incorporate them in the place branding? Like, for example, in-house, like, I don't think so, like any company by now has an in-house sustainability department. So do you see this industry, place branding industry, from now has tie-ups with, or say monopoly, or have few NGOs on panel to make their profile more stronger before pitching the plan to the government or the higher officials?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. For me, it's very simple. These are organizations that by and large have an international, if not global perspective. You can learn a great deal from them. We've introduced as a consultancy experts from those kind of sources to clients in the past. And it's a very fast way of accessing information and learning and data that it might take you years by yourself to actually get hold of. Equally, they may well have had a project running in a place very similar to yours, and therefore you can learn very quickly about the things that worked or don't work. So they exist, but I often find there's almost we all know about them to a degree. We hear about them in the news. We know their acronyms, but there's almost a kind of reticence to use the expression, get into bed with them, to work with them. I know one place that felt that they wouldn't be seen as important enough. I mean, this was just silly worries that, this international organization, part of the UN, wouldn't take them seriously. Far from it. They were able to put in 2 or 3 people for several months to actually begin to help that place with understanding the kind of action that might be available to them. So a definitive yes is the answer to your question. Was that helpful?
Do you see, like in a country like United Kingdom or even Scotland, because this organization, one of the founders is Duke of Edinburgh, WWF, and they have 5 agendas, and they have this vision of reducing the carbon footprint of UK by 40%. So do you think that places or maybe nations need new legislations when it comes to climate change, and they should incorporate this data in marketing and tourism?
Oh, yes, I do think so. I mean, the reason why a lot of local authorities in the UK have climate change emergency plan declarations is that the UK has signed up to the 2016 Paris climate change statement and passed legislation requiring British local authorities to declare climate emergencies by 2020, which the vast majority have done. I have to say that passing legislation without providing empowering sources of funding and resources is quite often a waste of time. I've been doing this kind of work for 40 years, so forgive me kind of looking back over time for a moment, but requiring a body like a local authority, a city, to do something without giving them the financial means to enact it is just hot air. What you have to do is to enable them give them powers and responsibilities to either raise money, borrow money, or give them grant aid to do it. To just require them to do it by themselves without thinking about the practicalities of how it will be implemented is a complete waste of time.
Kimya, you had a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little off topic, or maybe not off topic, but you were basically saying in your presentation, which makes absolute sense, that when the cities start focusing on the climate problems, it brings and adds values to its residents. I wanted to ask, though, if you think that it brings the same value to maybe tourism and to other stakeholders of the place, because at this point, if something starts happening in the city that's climate-wise beneficial, the residents benefit from it. But do you think that the tourist industry can benefit from it, for example, as well?
I do think so. I mean, I'm very aware from the work I've done, and I haven't been in central London now for about 13 months. I was very aware of where I was walking as a visitor on business and as a resident of a town in Sussex coming to central London for my entertainment. I'm very aware of where I was going to be subject to high levels of respiratory disease pollution. Tourists breathe the same air at a very simple level. Tourism depends on there being a quality environment, a quality of life. while you're in the place. Okay, if you're a day visitor, you're not going to get severely affected by high levels of respiratory diseases. But that's a kind of point of principle example for me. There are places where tourism gets significantly affected by this. That is tourism to very hot countries that suffer from bushfires. I mean, there's virtually no wine tours taking place in California at the moment or southern Queensland. There are virtually no outward bound nature study tours taking place in those areas. They're at risk. So the bushfires burn down lots of forests, lots of vineyards, hotels. They affect all sorts of flora and fauna. And why would the tourist go there to see a hazy, burnt environment and breathe bad air? It has an impact. It doesn't happen to have an impact like that in every part of the world, but it's probably the most visual example of it.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. It makes sense.
I think something else to consider, Kimia, is that, ecotourism is a huge growth industry within a huge growth industry. So tourism already is a massive, massive industry, but ecotourism is one of the largest and fastest growing sectors within that. And I think that there are opportunities for places to provide tourist experiences that are sustainable. As people become more educated and more passionate about this, I think that tourists in general want to make decisions where they know they're not hurting the place by being there. So for example, going and staying at a giant luxury hotel where they wash the towels every day and there's a lot of waste of the food and it's, hurting the local environment. I think that as people become more aware of the dangers and the seriousness of climate change, they will be less willing to want to spend their money on things they see as being wasteful or more damaging, and more likely wanting to spend their money on things that they see as being helpful. So if places can bring in elements of their tourist experience, whether that's homestays, eco lodges, visits in areas where where you're making a very small footprint on the area, or where your money is actually being spent on lessening your carbon footprint, etc. I think those are really going to be effective marketing strategies for places to consider as well. Would you agree, Malcolm? Sorry to interrupt there, but
no, absolutely, and that's where I think I use the example of work I did in Ireland about 4 or 5 years ago in an area that sits between the Wild Atlantic Way and what's called Ireland's ancient East, which is the kind of middle swathe of Ireland. And they are looking at a tourism development strategy that is intrinsically related to better protection and management of the land, the flora, and the fauna. A consequence of that is that they're looking at homestays, eco lodges, and attracting businesses that invest in the community, so that they wouldn't be attracting a 4 or 5 star hotel, because by and large that hotel's profits go to a national capital or somewhere offshore. But they are wanting to see and support hotels that pay good wages to local people, who train those local people, who buy their produce, their vegetables, their meat, whatever, food and drink from the local supply chains. Particularly so in an area like that, because the concept, the defining central idea of the brand is actually ecotourism as sustainable tourism, as green tourism, that actually can generate money for the community, so that it no longer is a place that people grow up and leave to find economic prospects elsewhere. And it's the heart of where the potato famine happened in Ireland in the middle of the 19th century. So there's a really strong relationship there. And that is building back better, building back green in a way that equally recognizes the economic impact of that, but it's being driven by values that are akin to those which sustain work on the climate emergency. It's not an area that is significantly at risk from flood and heat and drought, but it is an area that could most certainly do with clean electricity, green charging points, etc. And so it gives an opportunity for that tourism strategy to take a lot of the ideas about what is green, not greenwash, but green depth, if I could call it that way, and incorporate that into the brand strategy for the place. And that, by the way, is a brand strategy, like most of the work that Bloom does, that doesn't start with communication. It starts with what we call the central idea, which Dylan may have explained to you before, that we want this to be an area that is seen to be like that. And therefore the action plan is, well, how do we build that to become real, to make a reality of that concept over time? And therefore your branding and communication strategy is about beginning to tell that story over time. And on something like that, you've got hordes of stories to tell. Every local homestay and eco lodge that's doing something about it, investing their own money, doing their own training. These are great news stories. What we found with the Atlantic Way was those kind of stories actually enabled people to go and stay with the people they saw telling the story.
So that's a really great example of
A marriage bureau.
That's a great example of the tourism strategy driving the economic development, but the central idea around the brand and the tourism strategy is about the greening and the locality and the, you know, the slowness and the just all of these sort of big trends we're seeing in the market, and that, but using that as a driver for bettering the lives of the people who actually live there, and then that becomes embedded and ingrained into the brand strategy.
Yeah, and it equally, it drives the communication strategy in this sense, not just with the stories, but actually with the targeting of the message of what's happening, the offer and the experience of the place and what the people of the place are doing to help themselves, targeting that to people who share those kind of values in the target market audience. And enabling, therefore, the investment in the marketing to pay more dividends in terms of what I'd call the right people coming to the area. Not right as of right, but exactly the people whose dollars or pounds you want to be spent in that area. And we're getting here to why strategic place branding is really about integrating the entire activity and offer of the area in line with that central idea of what you want people to imagine or recognize the area to be and what it's becoming.
We've got time for one more, if anyone's got a burning question. Those are really good questions, guys. Okay, well, I mean, with your applause or your thumbs up or, you know, the comments in the chat, I would really love it if you could show your appreciation for Malcolm spending his time in hopefully informing but also inspiring you into thinking about all of the ways that you as future place branders might be able to integrate climate mitigation strategies, storytelling, and also, you know, just greening in general into your place brand strategies, and how that actually has to become part of your driving central idea. And I, for one, I'm feeling really fired up from this talk today. So thank you so much, Malcolm. Really appreciate that.
Great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for the questions. And as I said to you before we started, Jenny, if you guys want to go to the Bloom website this afternoon and go to our journal, it just so happened that this morning I have written a piece that basically follows the structure of the presentation I've just given you. I didn't think it was going to be up there in time, but someone moved the digital bricks and mortar around to give me space. And It's a couple of pages, but it's a kind of aide-memoire of the key points of this presentation. If you want to go there and look at that, be very interested to hear what you have to say. And if you can, send me an email about any further thoughts you've had for this. We use every opportunity like this to try and get better at what we do, to get better at presenting it, to get better ideas. We never stop learning. We're lifelong learners. Learning for us doesn't stop when we leave the university, and it shouldn't stop for you either. Sorry, I'm preaching, forgive me.
Well, that's a generous offer. And as I've mentioned to you, Bloom Consulting is definitely one of the preeminent place branding consultancies in the world. They do have very high level, they work with countries and cities all over the world and have been doing for years. And Malcolm is president of Bloom Consulting, and we were grateful to also have Dylan come in a few weeks ago and recommend the 14 Steps to Nation Branding book, which you guys all have made available to you. And so I will be posting the article to the Bloom Journal article that Malcolm talked about. I'll post it in our Discord so that you all have access to it. And you can follow up with him on email if you have any feedback or questions. So with that, I will stop the recording. Thank you.